The Cornerstone Speech by Alexander Stevens is a response in many ways to Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address. It's also kind of seen as an appeal to kind of the larger world. We see kind of echoes of this, or rather, yeah, we see echoes of this when we talk, when the president gives any kind of speech, State of the Union address, inaugural speech, that kind of thing. You'll often see the opposite party that doesn't have the presidency issuing a speech or a statement or something like that. It's the same kind of logic here, right? So Stevens, this is a speech really for Americans in general, Southerners in particular, especially those in the border states. We're talking March 1861. Confederacy is still hoping to add a few more states to it, and so that's what he's kind of appealing to. Alexander Stevens was the vice president of the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis could not stand him, actually. Alexander Stevens was kind of a interesting, kind of hard to get along with kind of guy, but he is a politician, right? And so he does work his way, represents kind of a different wing, kind of that western section of the Confederacy, if you will. He was somebody who really believed in opportunity for white men. In fact, he was one of those men that was most eagerly concerned with gaining access to territory for white individualism. So that's kind of where he's coming from. So this is March 1861. He starts the speech, calls it the greatest revolution in the annals of history. And then, we haven't had any bloodshed. Again, a little bit of hyperbole, a little bit premature, considering that, the Fort Sumter hasn't happened yet. So we're talking kind of going from that. Stevens makes a statement that this new Constitution, the Constitution of the Confederate States, constitutes the subject to which your attention will be partly invited. In other words, part of the speech is going to talk about how great the new Constitution is, how great the Confederate States of America are. Remember, he's trying to make an appeal to those border states to try to increase the number of states that are joining the Confederacy. So that's part of why he's doing this. And basically goes into saying that, that in many ways, this Confederate Constitution protects the same things, right? It protects rights, franchises, liberties. No citizen is deprived of life, liberty, or property. So again, he says no citizen. In other words, you can imply that, what does he mean by citizen? Some changes have been made. Some of these I would have preferred not to have been made, but other changes, he supports. He says overall they form a great improvement upon the old Constitution, the United States Constitution. And so he basically, is making a speech in support of it. One of the supports, he says, is this issue of tariffs. We're going to get rid of this debate over tariffs, seeing it as giving an advantage to one particular class of people over another. You guys are familiar with the argument about the manufacturing sector versus the agricultural sector, the North versus the South. He's basically making the case or arguing that that the North has had an unfair advantage as far as tariffs are concerned, and they have essentially made it so in the Confederate Constitution that tariffs won't be that way. So that has been removed. He goes on to talk about internal improvements, saying that the South has typically opposed the idea of using kind of the revenue of the United States to support internal improvements that don't benefit all the states. We've talked about this a little bit too, how, some of the debates about the canal system and the roads and the railroads, this question, why should tariff money, why should revenue money go to not help everybody? And he makes the case later on, on the next page where he starts talking about the issue, why should, he says, what justice was there in taking this money, which our people paid into the common treasury on the importation of our iron, and applying it to the improvement of rivers and harbors elsewhere? The true principle is to subject the commerce of every locality to whatever burdens may be necessary to facilitate it. In other words, if it doesn't benefit us, then we shouldn't have to pay for it. This is kind of the idea that we see with toll roads, right? If you don't want to pay for a toll road, then don't drive on a toll road. Here's the dilemma with that, though, I would argue, not just with toll roads, but with Stephen's argument, is that sometimes that to take this kind of very narrow view about what stimulates economic growth means that by not having internal improvements that connect one state with another, is very likely to make it so that you hurt the development of industry and business in all the areas where that commerce would have taken place. So if we don't build a road if we don't build a road from, Frisco to Dallas, and, what about all the places in between, all the businesses in between those places that could grow and develop, and, property that could enhance in value? So the, internal improvements, it's a very small-minded kind of view of internal improvements to say that, well, it should, only the people that use it should pay for it. Because really this, internal improvements are something that helps everyone, helps the national economy in many ways. So just kind of keep that in mind, that he's making this point there. He also talks about how cabinet ministers and heads of departments can also be in their Congress. This is something that the United States Congress does not allow, even to this day. If you're going to be a cabinet member, you cannot be in Congress. The idea being that it kind of, separates the power, right? Division of power. No one person can hold too much power. Lessens the likelihood of conflict of interest and that sort of thing. And clearly they're not having any problem with this. They give the president 6 years in office instead of 4, basically saying that, that it will basically, it's supposed to remove the temptation to abuse power. I'm not sure that I see this. In fact, there's a whole lot about these few paragraphs here where he's talking about the nature of government that, to me, first off, seems to consolidate power in the hands of a few men. Second off, seems to make it look a lot like the British system in a lot of ways, which I think is kind of ironic. Kind of this, appeal to sort of an aristocratic idea. It's very kind of odd to me. Not odd, really. It makes sense given the South and kind of their own self-defined. We're an aristocracy. The wealthy plantation owners and that kind of thing. But I do think it's kind of interesting to recognize that they're putting power in the hands of a few men, and they're giving them a lot of power in a lot of ways. And so he goes on to say in the next part, and this is where it really gets interesting, not to be tedious in enumerating the numerous changes for the better, allow me to allude to one other, though last, not the least. This new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery, as it exists among us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. So pretty clear, right? This new Constitution, it's all about slavery. They've made some other changes on some issues that Southerners disagree with, but primarily it has to do with slavery. Talks about how Jefferson recognized that slavery was going to be an issue, and that they have now seen that it is indeed a fact that slavery was going to divide the Union. And then he goes into putting in that, he makes the point that the Constitution was kind of based on the ideas of the time, this idea, that the enslavement of the African was actually a violation of the laws of nature, but that's what they thought, the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution kind of provided these essential guarantees about all men are created equal in the spirit of the laws of nature make all men equal, except, of course, that that's not really true, right? It might have been true in 1776, but it's not true now. In fact, he says those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. It was a sandy foundation, and the government built upon it fell when the storm came and the wind blew. So in other words, Jefferson had a great idea. It was bad. And so now we've just, we know that now, and so we're moving on. I think it's kind of very interesting to see him kind of referring to this, especially since we know how many people, women, for instance, African Americans, other countries, that appeal to this notion of all men are created equal as kind of a foundation for their own independence, right? And there is no more all men are created equal. He says that our new government is founded exactly upon the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests. This is where we get the idea of cornerstone speech. On the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical philosophy and moral truth. It has been slow in the process of its development, like all other truths in science. It has been so even amongst us, meaning the Confederacy. People even 20 years ago had struggled with this. There are those in the North who still cling to these errors with a zeal above knowledge we justly denominate as fanatics. So anyone up north that thinks that African Americans can be equal, they're fanatical. This fanaticism springs from an aberration, a defect in the mind. With a zeal above knowledge, an aberration of the mind from a defect in reasoning. It is a species of insanity. So, in other words, they're crazy. They're crazy to think African Americans can be equal. One of the most striking characteristics of insanity in many instances is forming correct conclusions from fancied or erroneous premises. So, with the anti-slavery fanatics, they assume that the Negro is equal and hence conclude that he is entitled to equal privileges and rights with the white man. If their premises were correct and their conclusions would be legal, but since their premises are wrong, everything is wrong. So, in other words, right, it is fanatical to believe that African Americans can be equal. That if you thought that, then maybe people thought that in 1776 or 1820, but they certainly don't think so now. And to continue to cling to that idea now is just nuts. I also think that it's interesting. There's no reference to women. So I wonder what Alexander Stephens would have thought about women's rights. Probably not very much, I imagine. He probably thought those women were crazy. So he kind of goes to that argument. He's basing this argument a lot on science, that the social fabric is firmly planted and all that kind of stuff. That science justifies this. So we see a reference to kind of this eugenics science that I told you about, this kind of false science that, certain people are inferior. This is the foundation for the Holocaust, eventually. So understand that this science has a pernicious effect in our society. And then he goes into a great deal of justification. May we not therefore look with confidence to the ultimate universal acknowledgement of the truths upon which our systems rest. He talks about that many governments have kind of been built on this idea of social classes and aristocracy. That while it's wrong to make your people of your same ethnicity or race is served, there's nothing wrong with recognizing that there's a certain class of people that should not be equal. And so he goes on to say that our system commits no such violation of nature's laws, that with us, all the white race, however high or low, rich or poor, are equal in the eye of the law. Not so with the Negro. Subordination is his place. He, by nature or by curse against Canaan, is fitted for the condition which he occupies in our system. So, in other words, the governments that took their own people and made them into social classes, made them serfs or whatever, that was wrong. But when you take somebody whose natural condition, it's perfectly okay, right? And that this is in conformity with the Bible. The Bible supports this, right? And so I think it's very interesting to recognize his argument, to see some of those defensive slavery conceptions kind of put into play here. We also see that he says, how can we have the ability to maintain our nationality among the world? How can we function? How can we maintain our position? that people are concerned. This is a real question. This is particularly a question in the border states, if you will. And he goes on to say, hey, we want the border states to join us, but they don't have to. And then says, hey, the Confederate States of America, is doing great, that we are strong enough to be successful. We have all this land, all this territory for all this growth. We have plenty of land that's worth a ton of money, therefore we can get taxes. I ask you to refer back to the resources, image graphics. But he's saying, hey, we've got all this taxable land, right? So we're going to be great. We don't have very much debt, and so we're going to be okay, right? We're going to do just fine, and we'll be fine whether or not the border states join us, although we do hope that they do. He goes that, and then he has this crazy kind of argument here. These differences of opinion, talking about people in the South, right? Questions about debt, questions about property, questions about how successful the Confederacy can be, right? He actually says these differences of opinion were more in reference to policy than principle. That Jefferson had said there might be differences of opinion without differences on principle, and that to all extent we are all Federalists, all Republicans, which Jefferson did say that. So now it may be said of us that whatever differences or of opinion as to the best policy and having cooperation with our border sister slave states, that we're all cooperationists. So in other words, he'll cooperate with the border states, but not with the United States. That it's okay for people in the Confederate States to have a difference of opinion, but not okay for the states, for the southern states to just have a difference of opinion with the North. I just find that incredibly crazy, right? Anyways, just had to point that out. And then he goes on to say that that cutting loose from the old government would be the only way, that there's been no bad effects from all of this that usually attend revolution. So he calls it a revolution himself, which I think is kind of interesting. And that other revolutions have had a lot worse effects. Now, again, I think he's being a little bit preemptive there. I think enough time has passed. He goes on to say, that, see, where are we? Will everything commence so well continue as it has begun? I can only say that it depends on ourselves, that a young man can work his way up. He's the architect of his own fortunes. So as such, so are the Confederate States. That if we have virtue and intelligence, that we'll do fine. He's actually making a reference in that paragraph, talking about kind of factions and essentially asserting that in the Confederate States there won't be factions. So think about Abraham Lincoln's inauguration speech, where he talks about how, if you're going to secede, what's to say people won't secede from you? Well, Alexander Stephens' response to that is, hey, it's going to be fine. We don't have those kind of factions in the Confederate States, which I think is hilarious, right? And then he kind of pokes some fun at the French Revolution, talking about how in the French Revolution they didn't have that virtue, and this is what led to such chaos and anarchy. But that's not going to be the case here, in the Confederate States, and says that the process of the disintegration of the old Union can go on with absolute certainty if we pursue the right course, if we're true to ourselves, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's very interesting to see him, again, kind of tear down Lincoln's assertion that this is anarchy, and kind of, assert that the Confederate States are going to be doing just fine. And that, that if they have to go back, so like if the other states in the United States later on want to join, some of the ones that are currently in the North that don't have slavery, that there can be a process of reorganization and assimilation. So he's even throwing in here this idea of reconstruction for the other parts of the United States, which I think is kind of interesting. And he says, yes, there's going to be some disruptions of the post office, but, that's a minor inconvenience. Which, of course, Abraham Lincoln had said that, of course, they would continue postal service. I find that amusing, that it even had to throw in this post office connection. And that as to whether we shall have war, it all matters on whether we shall settle these differences amicably. That that the idea of coercion shadowed forth in the president's inaugural seems not to be followed up thus far any more vigorously or as vigorously as expected. He's talking about Fort Sumter here. Fort Sumter is kind of being besieged, if you will, and so they haven't abandoned Fort Sumter, even though they've been asked to. So what they're doing, they're hoping that they will go ahead and leave, that they won't actually have to take action. So I just think that's kind of interesting, that he's kind of hoping that this will all wind its way down. And then he goes on to say that the surest way, to secure peace is to fight for your rights, that the principles and positions of the administration of the United States with this, Republican Party presents some puzzling questions. Basically says, they don't want to allow an increase in slave territory, but they won't let us go, which totally misses the whole point of what Abraham Lincoln was saying. Again, different perspective there. He's twisting the facts to justify his case. He does make a reference about Texas, talking about how some of the people in the North didn't want to admit Texas because it was going to be a slave state. Now they don't want it to go, and kind of pokes fun at this, right? And goes on to say that it's because they want to benefit from slave labor. They say that, their philanthropy, their concern about slaves has to do with their financial interest. And that this is really what they're concerned about, collecting taxes to swell the fund so that they can then do what they want, internal improvements and all that kind of stuff, which is part of why he was making the statement earlier about tariffs and internal improvements and stuff. And so he goes on to say that the Constitution was a compact, and that it should be rescinded by mutual agreement of both parties. Which is kind of what Abraham Lincoln said, except, of course, he's missing the point that there is not a mutual agreement. So be sure that you've kind of really looked over the Cornerstone Speech. I will kind of give you a heads up for those of you who take the time to listen to this. Your Eastfield objective essay will ask you to specifically analyze the Cornerstone Speech. So this is the one speech that you really need to look at, although being familiar with the others will help you understand and write a good essay. This one in particular is the one that you need to have a grasp on. So read through it a couple times, maybe listen to this again, make sure that you understand what Alexander Stephens is saying, why he's saying it, how this is a response to the inauguration, and that sort of thing. So I'm going to stop this here, and then I will be talking about the president's inaugural cartoon and Abraham Lincoln's special session speech.